Hello and welcome to Talking Points. I'm Dave Kelly, Director of Advanced Media Production at Cal State Long Beach. Today we're going to talk about America's food supply. Most of us take it for granted that there will always be plenty of choices at the evening dinner table. However, are there threats on the horizon that could potentially challenge that notion of an endless abundance of food? My guest today is Dr. Jeannette Vaught. Dr. Vaught is a lecturer in the Department of Liberal Studies at Cal State Los Angeles. Welcome, Jeannette, and thank you for joining us for your second visit here at Talking Points.
It's so great to be back.
Well, let's go ahead and get started on this topic of food supply. I think we should acknowledge at the beginning that it's really a modern marvel, our agricultural system here in the United States. We have enough food to feed everyone. There are people that have food insecurity, but that's not because of a lack of abundance. It's an economic or social problem. And so we'll leave that for another topic, another day. But in terms of the food supply and our ability to generate sufficient amount of food, we're very good at that. Even so, we only have about 30 days supply of food in our warehouses, our store shelves, and so on here in the United States. Part of that is because it's a just-in-time kind of operation. Fresh food needs to move, so you don't want to keep the fresh food for very long. But nonetheless, it's only a 30-day supply, but because we're so efficient, we use a lot of technology, we can get things done and we can feed our population. However, are there potential threats on the horizon that we need to be thinking about that could threaten that notion of total food security?
No, I think that's a really important thing to be thinking about, and a lot of people take it very much for granted, the availability, especially in our modern culture, of being able to go to the store and get the food you need. Despite the fact that many people, as you did mention, have many difficulties in that, and those are cultural issues there. At the same time, the food supply does have some vulnerabilities, as any big supply chain, right, as any kind of big infrastructure does. To my mind and in my experience, talking to and reading the work of crop scientists as well as food chain analysts, and agricultural historians, I think the biggest thing to look out for, right, in our food supply is to make sure that the people involved in the food supply are cared for and supported and monitored in the correct ways, right? So the biggest vulnerability in our food supply that could potentially happen would happen at the farm worker level. If they are unable to do their jobs, to be able to pick and harvest the crops or to take care of the animals, this goes for both plant and animal agriculture, right? And to manage the systems in place for plant and animal agriculture in ways that allow for it to be safe for them to report any problems and to be able to communicate problems that happen very much on the ground. That is the prime area where there will be vulnerabilities that enter into our food supply chain, whether that be small scale or whether that be catastrophic. So in the sense, this is a people problem, right, more than a technology problem, and I'm sure I'll say that more than once in this broadcast, but the vulnerabilities in our agricultural system have to do with the ways in which people are treated and managed in these agricultural systems. And if we lose or threaten the ability of farm workers to be able to do their proper work, whether that be on the harvest level or on the safety inspection level, that's the biggest vulnerability to my mind that we should be paying attention to.
We're going to come back to inspections in a few minutes, but first I want to talk about agro-terrorism. That's a term that we've been hearing about since 9/11, actually. Homeland Security has been concerned about this, and they've generated some protocols and some guidelines in the event of a disaster related to agro-terrorism. And agro-terrorism would seem to be harder to inflict upon the U.S. than the more obvious and overt kinds of terrorism, such as what we saw on 9/11. Just a few statistics to throw out. As of 2016, we had over 2 million farms operating in the United States with 915 million acres, $212 billion worth of crops generated, and also about $182 billion in livestock and related products. So that's a lot of product and a lot of land. So is it harder to terrorize the country through agriculture than it would be with other means, and that's why it doesn't happen, or it's less of a threat?
You know, it's a little bit out of my expertise to say if it's harder or not harder. I don't have a lot of tools for judging that, but I can say that if we're talking about agriculture as a form, opposed to other forms of bioterrorism, right? We think about bioterrorism in terms of disease outbreaks like anthrax, right? And that has happened and does continue to happen, even in recent times. We hear that in the news. If we're talking about agricultural bioterrorism, it's about poisoning the animals, right? Or plants that provide our food, or poisoning the land that they exist on, right? And one of the ways in which it might be difficult for that to take place is because there are so many monitors of these places, right? You have safety inspectors, whether you're talking about government safety inspectors or private companies that do safety audits. You have people driving around farms checking on them all the time for any kind of disarray or sign of disease. You have just a lot of people on the ground in farmland, which sometimes we think about, right, farmland being not populated, right? But if you really are operating a good farm, yes, you have a lot of land that people don't live on, but they're paying attention to that land, right? And so the ways in which good farming practices make for good farming also might make it very difficult for bioterrorists in an agricultural context to get a foothold. So I can't say if it will or won't happen. I can't comment on the likelihood. It certainly hasn't really, right, in any kind of way that has made it up beyond any small attempt that we don't even know has happened. But on the other hand, good farming practices, all the way from managing the people to managing the product, can really help mitigate the effects of a potential kind of agro-terrorist attack. So that would be, I think, good farming is the good practice there.
Right, and so we have human monitoring of the product at all
Yes.
times. So
Yes.
that's a big factor, a big safety factor, or a defensive mechanism against any kind of agro-terrorism. Mm-hmm. We also have some natural factors or natural defense factors that could help us as well if we're paying attention.
Yes.
But again, we have to pay attention.
Yes.
And those might include some of the things that we talked about on an earlier program, including the bee colony collapse, for example, and also what we called the moth snowstorm, where it was written by a fellow who grew up in Britain, where many years ago, when in the summertime, before all of the pesticides took hold, you could see moths flying in front of headlights that looked like a snowstorm in the winter.
Right.
And so are those the kinds of things that we need to be mindful of and take a look at and notice if there's something going wrong with the food supply potentially?
Absolutely, absolutely. And one of the great things about that moth snowstorm story, right, is that citizens had that kind of experience and that kind of knowledge beyond just people who were involved at farms in rural places, right? And that's something that's actually being really lost in much of our societies, are these abilities to kind of see the biomarkers around you of how our nature is doing. So thinking about, paying attention to bees, paying attention to the insect life, paying attention to the kinds of plants and birds that are around you. In farming communities, this is extremely important, right? It's knowledge that is vulnerable to being lost, but is still being held. And those kinds of attentive behaviors to how your ecology is working around you, I think, are really key to those kinds of being able to prevent or know if something is happening, whether it be bioterrorism or something going on in the environment as well.
And since we're talking about connection to the ecology and to the environment, that leads to the next question about the advent of grocery stores. And of course, with modern agriculture came the modern grocery store and the grocery chain and big supermarkets. And so this actually has put distance between the consumer and the food product and how it's raised. And so most people in today's world have never hunted. Most people probably haven't really even fished. And a lot of people haven't raised a garden or raised food or grown food in a garden. So that being the case, does that disconnection between the consumer and where the food comes from tend to make us more cavalier about our food supply? And would we be less wasteful if we knew how hard it was and how much energy it took to grow and raise that food?
Maybe, right? I think that this issue of disconnection is a really important one, and to think about it too in terms of how that's transformed over time. One thing I really resist is to think about, this fantasy that there was this past where everybody farmed their own food and it was awesome and great and everybody was happy and knew so much. But, human systems of agriculture and human societies in cities all over the world depended on exploited human labor to basically feed them, right? Whether we're talking about slaves in Sparta or serfs in England or enslaved people here in the United States, and now our current system, right, of employing, for the most part, many vulnerable, undocumented people to provide most of our food. So disconnection from the food supply allows that to be uncritically appraised by most of our society. We don't think about that. And also, one of the ways in which grocery stores in our kind of modern context has really increased disconnection is, like you say, people feel like there's not a lot of connection to the actual production of food in terms of gardening or fishing or hunting, right? Which of course was not always what everybody did in the past, but still is this kind of nostalgic idea. And the true thing is that a lot of knowledge about food and the food systems that give us our food is lost in these disconnected worlds, right? Where you can go to the grocery store and pick up beautiful, gorgeous food and not think about how it was produced and how it got to you. That is both a cultural issue where we don't see the kind of systems in which food is produced, and it's also a real loss of knowledge about the actual organisms themselves and their ecologies and environments. And that has increased dramatically over the past 50 years. So that's something that I think that we really should be aware of.
We just have a couple minutes now before the break.
Okay.
So let's talk about that notion of distance from the production of the food. And I mentioned waste in the previous question. And so America has the greatest percentage of waste at the consumer level in food production. Now, the good news is that we don't waste very much comparatively in the production, the handling, and the distribution of the food. We've got that down pretty well because of refrigeration and modern technology and so forth. In the third world, it's just the opposite. There's very little waste at the consumer level, but a lot of waste at the production and harvesting, packing and handling and distribution and so on. In some third world countries, they don't even have enough folks available to harvest. And so there are crops that literally die on the vine and rot on the vine because they just can't pick it all. We don't have that problem here. So, but we do have the highest percentage of waste at the consumer level. About 60% of our waste is at the consumer level, which means people are not eating the food that they're buying, or they're not eating all of it or enough of it and throwing a lot of it away. Europe has a similar problem, not quite as bad as ours, and then third place is industrialized Asia. So what can we do in the United States to reduce the consumer waste?
That's a really great question, and I think one of the things to think about, before getting too far into the consumer waste issue, is to think about this idea that food dies on the vine and it's a waste. Well, in one way, yes, right, but it's also nutrient cycling. And this is something that in our country and in industrialized countries more generally, we really forget and have forgotten how to do. We've taken that out of our thing. So the consumer waste that we produce is actually much more impactful in a negative way than, say, the food dying on a vine would be for people who practice subsistence agriculture or not modern agriculture. So for the amount of waste that people produce, it primarily goes into landfills, right, where it produces more pollutants and does not sequester carbon and does not go back into the soil. So in order for our society to kind of rebalance that, we have to really think about the food waste that we produce. You have to shop much more carefully for the foods that you will be able to use, right? That requires going against marketing at grocery stores, which wants you to fill your fridge with all this abundant, beautiful, fresh food that is going to go to waste before you can buy it. And to think too about the ways in which you can return your food scraps or unused natural food products to the nutrient cycle. So many cities, Long Beach is one of them, has kind of urban composting options. Long Beach will take your food waste at the farmer's market, right? So even if you didn't get to eat those apples this week, you can put them into the compost and it will go back into the nutrient cycle and go back into the soil, which is one of the key areas that we really need to do better at. And thinking too about making sure that when you are buying fresh food, you have a plan for exactly how to use it, who's going to eat it, when they're going to eat it, and how that's going to happen. And again, it's a habit that you need to change, and we're kind of marketed against that. So you've got to really make an effort.
On that note, we have to go to the break. And when we come back from the break, we'll get into more details about how technology is facilitating modern agriculture. Stay tuned.
Get involved. Become a leader in the well-being of our nation, actively lending your voice and energy to promote wellness. Be the voice for public education and health education in schools, community organizations, hospitals, and clinics. You can become part of this exciting field with a degree from Cal State Long Beach.
Welcome back to Talking Points. I'm Dave Kelly, and my guest today is Dr. Jeannette Vaught. And Jeannette, before we went to the break, we were talking about reducing waste, and I promised the viewers when we came back that we would talk about how technology is being utilized to facilitate modern agriculture. So let's get started on the technology topic now. One of the things that has occurred in recent years is the development of what's called the blockchain, where you can track transactions and movement of product and so on, and it's an immutable record that cannot be changed or altered, so you know exactly where things are happening and at what time and so forth. And so we are now utilizing this to tell the consumers, if you want to track where your carton of pears or your crate of pears is coming from, let's say it's coming from Chile, you can track it all the way here to the US. And you can see where it's been and where it was housed and so on. So does the blockchain really advance this notion of consumers being connected to the food supply and knowing that their food is being protected from so-called foodborne illnesses? Or did we already have that system or a similar system, not the blockchain, but a system in place that was protecting us in that way?
Absolutely. On a consumer level, I think that the possibility that blockchain kind of provides for you to be at the grocery store and you can scan a QR code on your cell phone, right, and be like, oh my gosh, this is exactly the path that my orange took to get to my hand. Like, that's kind of cool, right? And that, on the one hand, really helps to address the problems that we talked about a minute ago about consumers being completely disconnected from where their food comes from. But on the agriculture side, blockchain is a solution in search of a problem. The supply chain, at least in this country, is so very tightly monitored and regulated, not just because of food safety issues, but also because it's very profitable, or at least able to be less profitable if you have a very efficient system, right? And so the agricultural companies have been making incredibly efficient and well-recorded systems of tracing their supply chains for centuries, and they have this down. So the blockchain is not going to revolutionize that. What it might do, right, is the same thing that agricultural technologies tend to do whenever they're adopted, and it's like, oh, this new thing, and it's never a brand new thing, and it's never a brand new consequence. Basically, they help larger farmers concentrate their wealth, to consolidate their holdings and buy out smaller farmers, to be able to exploit their workers more efficiently, right? And also to divorce the potential of the concentration of wealth from more people. So blockchain has the potential to do that for sure. It also has the potential to privatize more of the food inspection kind of infrastructure, to move that away from the FDA or USDA, because they can say, oh, look at all this proof that I have, right? Or this kind of immutable record. And so that's something we should actually be very concerned about as consumers, are the ways in which these technologies serve some but not others, and also the ways in which they very much might serve the existing and very visible goals of large agricultural corporations at the expense of smaller farmers. And that's the kind of thing that makes it actually really hard for people who are interested in farming to get into it. Because if you can't have a sustainable small farm, right, then you're not going to be able to move into that industry no matter who you are. And it just keeps that a very closed loop. So I'm suspicious of blockchain for that. It's not solving any agricultural problems, but on the consumer side, I think that there are some potentials for, more knowledge on the consumer side.
Well, let's talk about the USDA and the FDA, since you mentioned those. What we want to do most of all is prevent the foodborne illnesses, and I'm going to read something, and I hope I pronounce this correctly.
Okay.
There's a neurotoxin that's produced from Clostridium botulinum, commonly known as botulism, which is the deadliest naturally occurring acute toxin on the planet. So that sounds pretty scary, and we need to eliminate that and keep that from happening and infecting our food supply. So does the USDA have the proper protocols, and the FDA, to catch these things? Do the inspectors know how to prevent this? Do the workers who are responsible for picking and packaging, Do they know how to spot this? Do they know what to do? And are we pretty safe with the systems as they are currently set up?
We are safe with the systems as they're currently set up. The people who tend to get botulism in our Western culture typically have eaten food that smells pretty bad, and so it's pretty much on them. But as far as the systems in place to prevent this from infiltrating the food system, the regulatory apparatuses, they do what they can do, and actually they've been weakening over the past several decades, and that's an issue to really be paying attention to. But on the farm side, both farm workers and farmers are economically as well as culturally motivated to not let this happen. It can be a huge detriment anytime a pathogen, especially an extremely dangerous pathogen, is traced back to any particular farm, which, as we just talked about, those tracing procedures are very much in place, blockchain or no blockchain. So the benefits to the system as it is now is that it does, in fact, keep us very, very safe from these extremely dangerous pathogens and contaminants for the most part. And we can think about very recently government shutdowns, right, that have shut down partially the FDA inspection apparatus. This was not the time at which we had bad outbreaks of E. coli or botulism, right? And so even the non-regulatory apparatus is designed to keep our food system safe are able to operate in those kind of gaps where the regulatory apparatuses may be limited.
So we need to keep that kind of regulation in place and keep the government inspectors on their jobs as much as possible.
And trust the farm workers and allow them also to be able to report when things are going bad. They're on the ground.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, let's move along and talk about some more technology applications that are involved in agribusiness. And today they're talking about using bioengineering to bioengineer crops so that they're more drought resistant. We're developing corn stalks which are shorter so that they don't use as much nutrient energy out of the soil to grow, and perhaps they can survive in a shorter growing season. So if those kinds of things are occurring, is that a good thing? And the reason they're doing the bioengineering is because they believe that with a growing worldwide population, there will be a growing demand for food, so we need to increase the yields, and hence we need all of this bioengineering to make the crops more reliably grown in the field in spite of climate issues, and also to withstand pesticides. That's another part of it, is bioengineering these crops, corn and grain, to withstand lots of pesticide use. So what are your thoughts about the GMOs and the bioengineering that's going on?
Yeah, I think this is a really important question, especially as we are moving into a kind of emergency in relation to climate change, right? And the need to really think about how we're going to be able to use our land in changing circumstances. GMOs have been used primarily now to patent specific genetics so that particular companies can profit from them. And we were talking about nutrient cycles a minute ago. What this allows, right, is for pesticides as well as fertilizers to be applied to the land so that more crops can be grown on that land without killing those plants or without having to grow any other plants. And so if we think more in terms of nutrient cycles and less in terms of bioengineering products, I think we'll actually be able to make a lot more progress and actually create a more sustainable agricultural system for everyone, not just for large agricultural companies. I've been reading a lot recently about biochar, which is this very, very old agricultural practice from other parts of the world, where biological materials, which includes raw sewage, right, can be turned into actually a really wonderful, nutrient-rich soil helper, right? And this is a really great green technology that we know how to do. Humans have known how to do it for a really long time, but because it's not getting subsidized, right, because it's not kind of in this kind of pipeline of GMO technology and all that, it's really hard to make the economics work on farms. So I think that one of the ways that we can really change our responses in agriculture to changing needs is by turning towards really green, really sustainable technologies and shifting our economics towards supporting those.
Well, let's talk about digital farming. And this is where we're now going to use satellite photographs of land and landscape. We're going to put sensors in the fields to measure temperature and humidity, moisture, and so forth. And we're going to use a lot of software to crunch the numbers and look at this information and tell us where to plant the soybeans, where to plant the sunflowers, and where to plant the corn. Is all of this technology and the application of the software, worth all the trouble that it takes to utilize it?
Not at all. This is something that people know how to do. This is a people problem, not a technology problem. And there's nothing that software can do that people can't in that regard.
Okay. The next one is using corn for ethanol, growing corn and then turning it into ethanol for the gas tank. Is that helping us reduce our fossil fuel use and our carbon footprint, or is it mostly just a way to get rid of that surplus corn crop?
Dave, I feel like I've gotten very negative, but no. Biofuels are not doing that. Biofuels, basically, if we're talking about ethanol in particular, the amount of energy it takes to make it is about equal to the amount of energy it burns, right? So it has a net zero energy gain in our wider energy economy. And so it's really not doing anything for us. What it's doing is padding the pockets of the fuel companies and the agricultural companies who can profit from that byproduct. So please, no with biofuels. I know it seems really great, but and 10 or 15 years ago, I think maybe it had some promise, but we've learned a lot since then and need to look in different directions.
And I don't want to sound unduly negative myself here, but let's talk about crime and fraud for just a moment. We are starting to run low on time.
Okay.
But in the past, there have been instances where horse meat was mislabeled as hamburger meat. And of course, the food companies usually say, oh, it was just a mistake in packaging and labeling. And so we don't know, but that's their excuse. So we'll put that aside for a moment, but we do need to talk about another problem that is occurring worldwide now, and that's the theft of honeybees.
Yes.
And why are we seeing this theft of honeybees, and what's behind it?
Well, bees are a really big business now, and the thing that has spurred this is the growth in consumption of almond products, so almonds and also almond milks. And here in the Central Valley, the amount of almond trees has grown exponentially, and they need honeybees to pollinate them. So commercial honeybee growers or beekeepers, they have hundreds and hundreds of hives, and they'll truck them down to the Central Valley when the almond trees bloom in the spring. And thieves will steal those hives and erase or paint over any markings of ownership, sell them as their own, and make those profits themselves. So the farmers or farm companies, the ag companies, will pay the beekeepers huge fees to be able to use their bees to pollinate. And so thieves will steal those hives, make those profits, and then also keep the bees and make the honey from them in the summer and profit off that as well. So what would be income for beekeepers becomes income for thieves, and it's really all because of this kind of explosion in the almond market, that the market for bee and bee products, honeybee products, has gone up so high.
We have about 10 seconds left, so in about 10 or 15 seconds, what do you think of urban agriculture, where people grow their own gardens?
Do it. It's so great. We need more people to do that. I know that it's not going to make a huge dent in food deserts and sustainability now, but the knowledge that you'll gain and the community that you'll build, the more people that do it, the more we can learn and grow together. So yes.
And on that note, we'll have to bring the program to a close. Thank you for being here today. And thank you for joining us on this edition of Talking Points. Be sure to join us again soon for the next episode. Until then, I'm Dave Kelly. Have a nice day.